The day I discovered my son had pawned my war medals for a new phone was the day he sealed his own fate, though he had no idea what I would do next. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I can still see the empty display case, its velvet lining bare where the medals once rested, the faint outlines pressed into the fabric like ghosts of sacrifices past. Those medals were not decoration. They were my life condensed into metal, each one earned with sweat, terror, and the kind of scars no one can see. To find them gone was like losing my comrades all over again, only this time it was my own flesh and blood who had betrayed me. The truth came fast and merciless. A pawn slip left on the dresser told me everything I needed to know. There was no mistake, no burglar, no chance the medals had simply been misplaced. My son had taken them, traded them away for quick cash, and spent it all on the glowing rectangle he now carried like a trophy. When I confronted him, my heart still clinging to hope, I wanted to believe I'd see guilt or shame flicker in his eyes, but there was nothing of the sort. He looked me dead in the face, that brand new phone lighting up his smirk, and said, "They were just old bits of metal. This matters more." His thumbs danced across the screen as if to underline the insult. Just old bits of metal. I felt the words like a blade, cutting through years of sacrifice and silence. To him, they were worthless trinkets. To me, they were reminders of nights spent awake with gunfire in the distance, of brothers whose names are carved into stone, of the day I came home alive when others did not. I carried those medals like a weight, a promise that I would remember what so many never could, and he had reduced them to cash for vanity. I could barely breathe as the fury rose inside me. My hand gripped the back of a chair until the wood creaked beneath my fingers. I didn't shout. I didn't explode. Instead, I stared at him in silence, and for the first time I saw him not as my son, but as a stranger who had desecrated something sacred. He thought I would forgive him, that I would do what I always did, swallow my hurt and move on. But something inside me had broken. Or maybe something long buried had finally awakened. He thought he had bought himself freedom with that phone, that I would stew in disappointment until I eventually let it go. He couldn't have been more wrong. He had no idea that from the moment I saw that pawn slip, I was already planning what came next. That night, after the confrontation, I sat in my chair and stared at the emptiness where my medals used to be. The case, once a place of pride, looked like a grave now, a hollow lined with velvet shadows. My son had dismissed them as just old bits of metal, but to me, they were the sum of everything I had endured, every scar I carried both on my body and in my mind. To know they were gone, reduced to a pawn slip and some quick cash, was like being told that none of it had ever mattered. I thought of the years I spent in service, of the weight of the uniform on my back, of the sound of boots on dirt that echoed long after the missions ended. Each medal was more than a symbol, it was a story. One carried the memory of a night we thought would be our last, the way the stars looked overhead when we braced for the enemy. Another marked the day I carried a wounded comrade through chaos, promising him he would see home again, even though I wasn't sure I'd live to keep that promise. These weren't decorations. They were pieces of my soul. And now, in the eyes of my own son, all of that was worth less than the latest phone. A device that would be outdated and forgotten in months had outweighed years of sacrifice, blood, and honor. That was the measure of what my life's work meant to him. I tried to tell myself it was only objects that had been lost. Metal and ribbon could be replaced. But deep down, I knew better. What had been truly stolen was respect. My son hadn't just taken the medals. He had stripped away the dignity attached to them, the reverence I thought even he would understand. That cut deeper than any theft of property ever could. The silence of the house pressed down on me as I wrestled with that realization. I remembered holding him as a baby, promising I would give him a better life, one free from the hardships I had endured. I worked, I sacrificed, I gave everything so he could grow up safe. And now he had taken the very symbols of those sacrifices and sold them off without a second thought. I wondered then if I had failed him somehow. Had I been too soft, too forgiving when he was young? Had I let his arrogance grow unchecked, thinking it was harmless? But as the hours passed, the self-blame faded. No, why he had chosen this. He had looked at those medals, knowing what they meant to me, and decided they were worth nothing. He had made his choice, and with it, he had shown me who he really was. The sting of betrayal turned slowly into something colder, something steadier. My grief hardened into resolve. I had carried pain before, heavier than this, and I knew how to shoulder it. What I had not done before was turn it into a weapon. But now, for the first time, I was ready. I remember the first time I held those medals in my hands. They were heavy, far heavier than they looked, and not just because of the medal. They carried nights of fire, of waiting for dawn with fear lodged in my chest, of making choices I still see when I close my eyes. Those ribbons and emblems were more than recognition. They were proof that I had survived what others had not. They were my promise to the men who never came home. But my life of sacrifice didn't begin or end on the battlefield. Long before my son pawned them away, my life had been built on giving everything I had for others. I was a young man when I enlisted, barely more than a boy. I left behind my parents, my first love, and every comfort I had ever known because I believed in service. I believed in something greater than myself. Nights blurred into weeks, weeks into months of training, deployment, and survival. I spent years carrying weight on my back, rifle in hand, sleeping in mud and dust while my body ached in places I did not know could ache. And when I finally came home, I did what every soldier tries to do. I built a life. I found steady work. I scraped together enough to buy a modest house, and I swore I would give my family a life better than the one I had known. I worked nights, weekends, double shifts. There were years when I hardly slept. My hands cracked from labor, my body bent under the strain, but I kept pushing because I had a son to raise. He never went hungry. He never knew the weight of bills unpaid or shoes too worn to walk in. When he was sick, I stayed up by his bedside, whispering prayers in the dark. When he wanted toys or new clothes, I worked extra hours to make sure he had them. I traded my own rest, my own dreams, for his comfort, and in my heart, I believed it was worth it. Every ache, every scar, every hour spent working instead of living, I told myself it was all for him. And yet, as I sat there staring at the pawn slip, I realized how wide the gulf was between us. He had grown entitled, careless, blind to the cost of the life he lived. To him, sacrifice was invisible because he had never had to taste it. While I carried the weight of service and labor, he carried only the weight of his own vanity, the shallow hunger to keep up appearances. He looked at my medals, at all that they represented, and saw only scrap value. The contrast burned through me. My life had been built on sacrifice. His had been built on taking. I had given him everything, and he had given me betrayal. That realization dug deep into my chest. For the first time, I saw that the son I had raised lived in a world entirely separate from the one I had bled for. And that was the moment I understood. He would never comprehend sacrifice until he was forced to feel its consequences. I confronted him in the living room the next evening, the pawn slip clutched tight in my hand. The paper was crumpled from how many times I had folded and unfolded it, my thumb pressing into the ink as if I could force the words to vanish. But the words remained, a permanent scar, undeniable proof of what he had done. My son sat on the couch with his new phone glowing in his hands, his face lit by that artificial blue light. He didn't even look up when I entered. I stood there for a long moment, my shadow stretching across the floor toward him. "Where are my medals?" My voice was low, steady, but inside my chest, my heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. He looked up at me then, not startled, not guilty, just annoyed that I had interrupted whatever meaningless thing he was scrolling through. He shrugged. "I pawned them." He said it so casually, as if it were nothing more than admitting he had misplaced a sock. "You pawned them?" My voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. "They were just old junk, Dad," he said, leaning back against the couch. "You don't even need them. What do they really do for you? Just sit in a box collecting dust." He lifted the phone in his hand like it was some holy relic. "This is what actually matters now. This is life. Everyone I know has one. You wouldn't understand. Old junk. Dust." My fists clenched at my sides. I stared at him. The boy I had carried in my arms, the boy I had sacrificed my youth to raise, and all I could see was a stranger with arrogance etched into his face. My throat tightened with a mix of fury and grief. "Those medals," I said slowly, fighting to keep my voice from shaking, "were earned with blood, with sacrifice, with nights I thought I would not live to see the morning. Men died for what they stand for." I stepped closer, my shadow falling across his phone, but he didn't even flinch. "And you sold them. For this?" He rolled his eyes. "Dad, stop being so dramatic. It's not like they were worth anything. You can't eat medals. You can't spend them. At least I got some real value out of them. You should be thanking me for keeping up with the times." Thanking him. The words made bile rise in my throat. He had no idea what those medals meant, no idea what he had stripped from me. I realized then that it wasn't ignorance, it was indifference. He knew enough to understand they mattered to me, and he had still chosen to trade them away. I felt my hand tremble as I gripped the back of the armchair, steadying myself. My voice came out cold, measured. "You may think those medals were worthless, but one day you will understand just how valuable they truly were." He smirked, lifting the phone back to his face. "Whatever you say, old man." And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. He thought this was the end of it, but in truth, it was only the beginning. I sat alone in the kitchen after the confrontation, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight I could not shake. My son's words repeated in my mind again and again. Just old junk. Each time they echoed, they seemed to cut deeper. I tried to steady my breathing, but the anger simmered quietly beneath the surface, pulsing like a slow-burning fire that refused to die. This betrayal had not been born overnight. It was the culmination of years of small, selfish acts, of thoughtless words, of moments I had brushed aside in the hope that he would outgrow them. I remembered the first time I caught him stealing from my wallet as a teenager. He laughed when I confronted him and said it was only a few bills, nothing worth getting upset about. I let it go, convincing myself he was just young and reckless. Then came the lies, one after another. Lies about school, lies about the company he kept, lies about the things he wanted. He always wanted more. Shoes, gadgets, clothes that he claimed everyone else had. I broke my back working overtime to give him those things, believing that one day he would see the sacrifices I made for him. I believed that gratitude would eventually take root. But it never did. Every time I gave, he took more, and respect never followed. Now, the truth stood in front of me like a cruel revelation. My medals, the most sacred symbols of my life, had been pawned away for a screen, not for survival, not to put food on the table, not to cover rent. He had traded them for vanity, for a piece of glass and metal that made him feel powerful in the eyes of his peers. To him, appearances meant more than blood, more than sacrifice, more than honor. I thought back to the nights I worked through exhaustion, when every muscle in my body screamed for rest, yet I pushed on. I thought of the years I went without new clothes, without luxuries, without even small comforts, so that he could live in ease. I thought of the times I carried him when he was sick, of the quiet prayers I whispered into the dark, begging for his health and his future. I had shielded him from hardship, thinking I was protecting him. Instead, I had raised someone who saw sacrifice as invisible and respect as optional. The betrayal was not only in what he had done, but in what it revealed. He had never truly seen me. Not as a man who had endured war, not as a father who had worked himself to the bone for decades. To him, I was a provider, nothing more. My feelings, my memories, my values, all of it could be discarded as easily as those medals he sold. The anger inside me did not explode. It hardened. It grew colder and sharper. I understood then that I was finished making excuses for him. This was not a mistake. It was a choice. And he was about to learn what it meant to cross a man who had spent his life carrying the weight of sacrifice. I could not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the empty case returned to me. The velvet outlines where the medals once rested burned into my mind like scars. My son's betrayal had not fallen from the sky. It was the final strike of a hammer that had been pounding for years. As I sat there in the quiet, I saw the smaller betrayals one by one, each moment of ingratitude that had led us here. I remembered the time when he was 16 and came home with a brand new pair of shoes that I had not bought for him. He bragged that a friend had given him the money, but I later found out he had stolen from his grandmother's purse. When I confronted him, he laughed in my face. She has plenty of money. She won't miss it. I should have been harder on him then, but I chose patience. I told myself he would learn. There was the time he crashed the car I had worked 3 years to pay off. He was careless behind the wheel, showing off to his friends. When I asked him what he was thinking, he rolled his eyes and said, "It's just a car. You can get another." He did not care that I had walked to work in the rain for months while saving for that car. To him, it was nothing but a toy. He never understood the value of money. I paid for his phone bills, his clothes, his schooling, even after he was old enough to start working. Whenever I suggested he get a job, he scoffed. "Why should I waste my time when you can cover it? You've got savings, don't you?" He believed my sacrifices were his entitlement. He saw my hard work as an endless well to draw from. Even respect, the simplest currency, he could not give me. I remembered the way he would mock my military service when he thought I wasn't listening. Once, I overheard him telling his friends, "Dad acts like he's some kind of hero, but he just sits at home now. He doesn't get it." That stung more than I admitted at the time. I carried his words like a secret wound, telling myself he was only trying to impress his friends, that deep down he respected me. But looking back now, I realized he never did. And then there were the values I tried to instill in him: honesty, hard work, gratitude. I spoke those lessons into him like prayers, hoping something would take root. But he ignored them at every turn. He lied without hesitation, manipulated with ease, and took everything for granted. He lived as if the world owed him. All those moments had been warning signs, signals that I had buried under the belief that he would change. But now, sitting in the silence of a house that felt colder than ever, I understood that this act of pawning my medals was not an accident. It was the truest expression of who he was. My son had been showing me who he was for years. I just hadn't wanted to see it. The sorrow that had weighed me down slowly began to harden into something else. I had spent hours drowning in grief, replaying every insult, every selfish act, every careless betrayal. For years I had excused his behavior, softened my voice, convinced myself that time and patience would mend what was broken in him. But as I sat in that hollow silence, staring at the pawn slip and the empty case, I understood the truth. Words would never be enough. Lectures would never change him. He had crossed a line so deep that forgiveness no longer had a place. I thought about confronting him again, raising my voice, trying to force him to understand what those medals meant. But the memory of his smirk came back to me, the casual shrug as he dismissed decades of sacrifice. To him, my pain was a joke. My history was dust. My honor was disposable. Talking would only feed his arrogance. I had tried words for years. They had done nothing. Now it was time for something else. A colder resolve began to form in me, like steel forged in fire. I had lived my life with discipline, with patience, with endurance. I had carried scars that never healed, memories that clawed at me in the night, but I never broke. I knew how to endure, how to bide my time, and how to strike with precision when the moment was right. If I could survive war, I could survive this betrayal. More than that, I could turn it into a lesson that he would never forget. Justice would be served, not through anger, not through fists or shouting, but through careful, deliberate action. I began to think about the things he valued most. He had made it clear enough: status, money, image. He cared for none of the things I valued, but he worshipped the shallow security he thought came from wealth and appearances. If that was the altar he knelt at, then it was the altar I would bring crashing down around him. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, my mind grew clear. The grief faded into the background, replaced by focus. I thought about the resources I still had, the documents, the accounts, the ties to men and women who knew how to get things done. I thought about the future I had once promised him, the safety net I had built with my own hands, and how easily I could unravel it. He believed he could take from me without consequence. It was time to show him how wrong he was. The plan was not fully formed yet, but the decision had been made. There was no going back. My son would feel the weight of what he had done. He would learn that betrayal has a cost, and that cost would be higher than he could ever imagine. In that moment, I no longer felt like a victim. I felt like a soldier again, calm, steady, and prepared. The battle had shifted, and this time I would be the one to choose how it ended. The next morning I woke with a clarity I had not felt in years. The weight of sorrow had been replaced by a steady resolve, a calm born from knowing that my path was set. My son thought the medals were gone forever, that the matter was closed. But this was bigger than medals now. This was about justice, about making sure he finally felt the consequences of a lifetime of taking without giving. And for that, I needed more than anger. I needed professionals. I pulled out my old leather notebook, the one I used to keep track of important numbers. My hands moved slowly as I flipped through the worn pages until I found the name I was looking for. An attorney I had known for years, a man I trusted. He had handled the paperwork when I bought my house, and I remembered how thorough he had been. He was the kind of man who left no stone unturned, and that was exactly who I needed now. When I called him, my voice was calm, almost too calm. I explained that I wanted to revisit my estate planning. "Things have changed," I told him. "I need to ensure my assets are protected, and I want to be very clear about who does and does not benefit from them." He agreed to meet me that afternoon. At his office, I laid it all out. I told him about my son's betrayal, about the medals, about the years of disrespect. He listened without judgment, his pen scratching across the yellow pad in front of him. When I finished, he adjusted his glasses and said, "You have every right to decide where your money and property go. If you want to exclude him, we can make sure the documents leave no room for challenge." His professionalism steadied me. It was no longer just an emotional decision, it was a legal one. From there, I made another call, this time to a financial advisor I had worked with during my retirement planning. We met in a quiet office lined with bookshelves and certificates. I explained my situation, and she leaned forward, her hands folded neatly. "If your goal is to cut him off from future access, we can restructure your accounts. We can establish trusts, allocate funds to charities, and designate beneficiaries who will respect your wishes. He won't see a cent." Her certainty gave me a strange sense of peace. Together, we went through every detail of my finances: bank accounts, insurance policies, property deeds. Piece by piece, I moved them into places where my son's name was erased. For years, I had thought of my estate as his safety net, something to guarantee him stability after I was gone. Now, I saw it differently. Why should he inherit what he had done nothing to earn? Why should he profit from a life of taking and disrespect? By the time I left those offices, the first stage of my plan was complete. My son had no idea that while he sat there basking in the glow of his phone, his future was quietly slipping away. He thought betrayal came without cost. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The nights that followed were long, but they were no longer restless. I did not lie awake drowning in grief or anger. Instead, I worked. My kitchen table became my command post, the same way a tent table once served as the center of strategy in far harsher places. Only now my battlefield was paper and ink, signatures and documents. The tools of this war were not rifles or maps, but wills, trusts, and bank statements. I spread everything out before me: deeds, insurance policies, old files I had saved in neat folders. Years of effort and planning sat in stacks across the table, the tangible result of a lifetime of sacrifice. For decades I had thought of all this as a gift to my son, a foundation he could stand on after I was gone. Now, I studied each page with new eyes, searching for weak points, for places where I could cut his name out cleanly and permanently. Late into the night, I pored over the fine print. I highlighted clauses, scribbled notes in the margins, and marked pages with colored tabs. My lawyer had already started the formal process, but I wanted to understand every detail myself. I had learned long ago that knowledge was power, and in war, ignorance could kill you. This was no different. If I was going to take back control, I needed to know exactly what was mine and exactly how to protect it from him. The work gave me a strange calm. Each time I crossed his name out of a document, I felt lighter, as if I were reclaiming pieces of myself that had been lost. Every signature, every change was a declaration that I would no longer be exploited. I was not the endless resource he believed me to be. In between the paperwork, I did my own quiet research. I read about inheritance laws, about how others had disinherited ungrateful children, about the mistakes people made when leaving their assets vulnerable. I compared notes, checked regulations, and double-checked the advice my professionals had given me. The discipline I once used to clean a rifle or plan a mission was now focused on eliminating every possible loophole he could exploit. The hours passed without notice. The clock ticked past midnight, then 2, then 4, but I did not feel tired. I felt focused, sharper than I had in years. I moved with the quiet precision of a soldier preparing for a mission. The medals might have been lost to a pawn shop, but my resolve was intact, stronger than it had ever been. By dawn, my plan was clear. The groundwork had been laid, the strategy mapped out. My son would not know what was happening until it was too late. To him, life would appear unchanged. He would sit on the couch with his phone glowing in his hand, arrogant and careless. But behind the scenes, I was stripping away every safety net he had ever relied on. The betrayal had wounded me, but the preparation gave me strength. I was not simply reacting anymore, I was in control. And soon, he would learn that betrayal carries a cost far heavier than he could ever imagine. A few days later, I heard him before I saw him. His laughter carried through the thin walls of the house, loud and careless, the kind of laugh that had no place in a home still heavy with betrayal. I walked quietly down the hallway, my steps soft against the floor, and his voice drifted toward me from his bedroom. He was on the phone with his friends, bragging the way he always did when he thought no one was listening. "Yeah, I got the new model," he said, his tone thick with pride. "Cost me a fortune, but it was worth it. Look at this screen, look at this camera. Everyone's jealous already." I could picture him there, leaning back on his bed, holding the phone up like a trophy, basking in the validation of shallow praise. Then his words shifted, and they cut sharper than a blade. My old man freaked out about it, but what does he know? He doesn't get it. He still clings to those dusty medals like they mean something. Who cares? They're just junk. I turned them into something useful. His friends laughed, and he laughed with them, the sound bitter in my ears. I froze in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall. The arrogance in his voice was unbearable, but it was the cruelty beneath it that hollowed me out. This was not a boy who had made a mistake. This was not someone who had acted out of desperation or confusion. He knew exactly what he had done, and he mocked me for it. "Honestly," he continued, his tone dripping with disdain, "he acts like those medals make him some kind of hero. He just sits around the house all day, telling stories no one wants to hear. He's stuck in the past. He doesn't understand how the world works now. Phones matter, status matters, not his old war stories." The words hit me harder than any bullet ever had. It was not enough that he had pawned my medals. He had to strip me of my dignity too, to reduce my life to nothing in the eyes of others. My breath caught in my chest, and for a moment I thought I might step into the room, confront him right then and there. But I held myself back. This was not the time. Confrontation would give him power, and I had already begun taking that away piece by piece. Instead, I listened. His friends egged him on, and he soaked in their approval like it was the only thing he needed in life. I realized then just how far gone he was, how little he valued respect, honor, or family. To him, my sacrifices were nothing more than material to be mocked, a punchline in his endless quest to seem important. I pulled back from the doorway, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. The anger I felt no longer roared. It cooled into something heavier, something unshakable. His arrogance was fuel, and with every careless word he gave me more of it. He thought he was untouchable, safe in the glow of his phone and the shallow laughter of his friends. But arrogance has a way of blinding a man to the storm gathering just beyond his sight. And the storm was already moving toward him. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier. Every time I passed the corner of the bedroom where the display case once stood, I stopped. My eyes locked on the empty velvet indentations, the faint dust lines where the metals had rested for decades. The emptiness became a reminder, not of what I had lost, but of what I was preparing to do. I would stand there, my hand resting on the wood, and I could almost feel the weight of those metals pressing into my palm again. That memory steadied me, sharpened me. Some nights I sat in my study, the one place in the house that still held fragments of my past. Photographs of my unit lined the walls, their faces frozen in time, their youth preserved forever in sepia and black and white. A folded flag sat in a triangular case on the shelf, its stars catching the dim light of the desk lamp. The air in that room always smelled faintly of dust and leather, a smell that reminded me of barracks and long deployments. Surrounded by those things, I felt the presence of the men I had once stood beside. I could almost hear them reminding me of who I was, of what I had endured, and of the resolve that still lived in me. My son's voice, his laughter, his arrogance, it all faded when I was in that room. Instead, I heard the echo of discipline, of strategy, of patience. A soldier does not rush into battle blindly. He waits. He plans. He chooses his moment carefully, and when he moves, he does so with precision. I sat at that desk with documents spread before me, my pen scratching across the pages. Each signature, each adjustment, was a move in a campaign. He thought the game was his. He did not realize the board had already shifted beneath him. At times I would find myself staring at the pawn slip, still tucked into my notebook. The paper was wrinkled from how many times I had held it, but I kept it as a symbol, not of loss, but of clarity. It reminded me that he had chosen this path. He had placed his greed above everything else, and in doing so, he had given me the justification I needed to act without hesitation. I moved through the house differently now. He noticed, though he didn't understand. He would see me sitting quietly in the study, my fingers brushing against the old flag or my eyes fixed on the photographs, and he would scoff under his breath, dismissing it as me being lost in the past again. What he did not see was the steel hardening inside me. I had stopped speaking about what he had done. I had stopped warning him, stopped pleading, stopped reminding him of respect and honor. Silence became my weapon. He thought silence meant surrender, but silence was the mask beneath which resolve sharpens. Each empty space, each quiet hour in my study was a promise. He could not see it yet, but every moment that passed was leading toward the day when the weight of his betrayal would come crashing down on him. I returned to the lawyer's office with a folder so thick it barely closed. Inside were decades of records, copies of deeds, bank statements, insurance policies, and the will I had written years ago when I still believed my son would carry my name with pride. I placed it all on the polished oak desk, the sound echoing through the quiet room like the first step of a march. My lawyer adjusted his glasses and nodded. He already knew why I was there. "This time," I said, my voice steady, "we leave no doors open. My son gets nothing." He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment before replying. "We can structure this so thoroughly that no challenge will stand. Once it is signed and sealed, there will be no question. His calm professionalism reminded me of briefing officers before a mission. I explained my wishes carefully, each one chosen with the weight of thought behind it. The estate would go to charities for veterans, organizations that supported families of fallen soldiers. Some portions would be placed in trusts for relatives who had shown me kindness and respect, people who had never once asked for anything but had earned my gratitude. As he took notes, I felt a quiet satisfaction building. Every line removed my son further from the life he thought was guaranteed. For years I had envisioned leaving him this house, my savings, even the medals themselves as heirlooms. But why should he inherit the fruits of sacrifice he never honored? Why should he live in comfort built from a life he dismissed as meaningless? We went through every account, every asset. My financial advisor joined us later that day, and together we carved out a plan so airtight there would be no path back for him. Beneficiary designations were rewritten. Retirement accounts were retitled. Even small policies were reassigned. His name vanished piece by piece until finally there was nothing left to tie him to my legacy. There was no anger in me as I signed each paper, only clarity. This was not revenge driven by heat or impulse. This was justice delivered with precision. Each signature was a declaration that respect matters, that betrayal has consequences. The ink felt final, like a seal pressed into wax, binding the truth into permanence. When it was done, I gathered the copies into my folder and stood. My lawyer gave a firm nod. It's finished. He cannot touch any of it now. When the time comes, it will be exactly as you've decided. I walked out of that office lighter than I had felt in years. The medals were gone, but something greater had been reclaimed. My son believed he had taken from me without consequence, that he had gained while I lost. He did not realize that I had already begun dismantling the future he thought was waiting for him. The safety net was gone, the inheritance erased. And when the day came for him to face that reality, the shock on his face would be worth more than gold. In the weeks that followed, I returned to silence. Outwardly, nothing seemed to have changed. I moved through the house with the same steady steps, made my coffee at the same time each morning, and kept to my routines. I offered no lectures, no outbursts, no warnings. My son believed the storm had passed. He believed that my anger had burned itself out, that my disappointment had dissolved into resignation. He mistook my quiet for surrender, and in his arrogance, he relaxed into it. I watched him closely. He strutted around the house with that phone in his hand like it was a crown, scrolling through endless feeds, laughing at messages, showing off every new feature to anyone who would listen. His friends came by often, and I overheard him retelling the story, twisting the betrayal into a tale of triumph. "He'll get over it," he would say with a dismissive chuckle. "It's not like he needs them anyway. I've got something better now." His words burned, but I let them pass. Silence was my shield. Sometimes he would glance at me across the table, testing the air, waiting for me to scold him again. When I said nothing, he smirked, mistaking my calm for weakness. He had no idea that each quiet evening, while he wasted hours staring into a glowing screen, I was finishing the details of the plan that would unravel his world. He thought he had won. In truth, I had already taken everything from him, only he hadn't realized it yet. I noticed small things too, things only a father who had sacrificed so much could see. He spent more time in front of mirrors, adjusting his hair, posing with the phone like it was part of his identity. He lived for attention, for validation from people who cared nothing for him. He carried himself with the shallow pride of someone who believed life would always bend to his desires. He didn't notice the bills I no longer left out for him to see, the paperwork that had disappeared from the house, the quiet meetings I continued to attend in town. Every night, I sat in my study beneath the watchful eyes of the photographs on the wall. The folded flag, the old uniform hanging in the closet, the faint smell of dust and leather, it all reminded me of the discipline that had shaped me. Patience had saved my life once, and it would serve me again. I let him live in his illusion of victory, because the longer he believed he had won, the harder the fall would be. This was the calm before the storm. I knew it. I felt it in the steady beat of my heart, in the cold clarity that sharpened my thoughts. He laughed and mocked, blind to the ground shifting beneath him, and I waited, silent and steady, knowing that when the storm broke, it would strip him of everything he thought was certain. I decided the reveal could not happen in private. My son had lived too long without accountability, too long believing that his arrogance went unseen. If he was going to face the truth, he would face it in front of family. There was power in that, a weight to public exposure that he could not shrug off with a smirk. So I called my siblings, a few close relatives, and even an old family friend or two. I told them I wanted to have a simple dinner, nothing more than a family discussion about the future. No one questioned it. They knew I had always been deliberate, always measured. When the evening came, I set the table carefully. The plates, the glasses, the food, all of it, laid out neatly, as if it truly were nothing more than a casual gathering. But in my chest, the tension coiled tight. This was not an ordinary night. This was the moment when the silence I had carried would finally break. The family arrived one by one, their voices filling the house with the familiar hum of chatter and greetings. My son came last, swaggering in with the same careless grin he always wore, his phone tucked proudly in his pocket like a badge of honor. He dropped into his chair without so much as a glance around, already pulling the device into his hand to check messages. As we ate, conversation flowed easily among the others. They spoke of work, of children, of small things that filled their days. I smiled and nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. I watched my son, watched the way he barely engaged, offering one-word answers as he stared at his screen. He had no idea what was coming. At one point, my sister asked about the medals. She had always admired them when she visited, often pausing by the display case with quiet respect. "I didn't see your medals in the bedroom," she said softly. "Did you move them?" I felt the air shift. My son froze for a second, then quickly raised his phone, pretending distraction. "Oh, those?" he muttered, trying to sound bored. "They're gone. Dad doesn't need them anymore." A few relatives exchanged uneasy glances, but they said nothing. I kept my expression calm, my hand steady as I poured myself a glass of water. Inside, my resolve tightened. He was still arrogant, still blind. He thought he could rewrite the story in front of them, that no one would challenge him. When the plates were cleared, I leaned back in my chair and let the silence fall. The room quieted slowly, conversations trailing off. My family turned their attention to me, sensing the gravity in my posture. My son remained glued to his phone, oblivious. "This dinner," I said finally, my voice low but firm, "is not just about family. It is about truth. And tonight, there are things that must be said." The table grew still. My son finally looked up, frowning in confusion. He had no idea that the mask he had worn for so long was about to be ripped away in front of everyone he thought would always shield him. The stage was set. The storm was ready. All that remained was to deliver the blow. The room was silent, except for the faint clink of silverware as someone shifted nervously in their chair. I looked at each face around the table, relatives who had known me through the decades, people who had seen the sacrifices I had made. Then I turned my eyes to my son. He stared back at me, frowning as if I had disturbed his peace. His phone lay face up beside his plate, glowing like a beacon of everything that had come between us. I reached into my pocket and placed the crumpled pawn slip on the table. It landed with a soft slap against the wood. "Does anyone here know what this is?" I asked, my voice steady, the calm before the strike. My family leaned closer, their brows furrowed. My son's eyes widened for just a fraction of a second, then he smirked and leaned back in his chair. "This," I continued, holding the slip between my fingers so everyone could see, "is the receipt for my war medals. The medals I earned serving this country, the medals that carried the names and memories of men who never came home. They are gone, pawned away." I let the weight of the words hang in the air before I added, "And it was my own son who sold them." Gasps spread around the table. My sister covered her mouth with her hand. My brother shook his head slowly, disbelief etched into his face. One of my cousins muttered a curse under his breath. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, suffocating. My son tried to shrug it off. "Oh, come on," he said, rolling his eyes. "They were just medals. It's not like he ever wore them or did anything with them. They were collecting dust. I put them to good use." "Good use?" I repeated, my voice sharper now, cutting through the tension. "You sold the symbols of blood and sacrifice for a phone that will be obsolete in a year. You traded honor for vanity." The faces around the table turned on him. My sister's eyes were wet with tears as she whispered, "How could you?" My brother leaned forward, his voice harsh. "Do you even understand what those medals mean? What your father went through for those?" My son shifted uncomfortably under their stares, his smirk faltering. "You're all overreacting," he muttered. "It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" I slammed my hand down on the table, the sound echoing through the room. My voice rose, but it was not uncontrolled. It was sharp, deliberate. Men died for those medals. They are not trinkets. They are not junk. They are the weight of sacrifice, the reminder that I came back when others did not, and you sold them for a toy. The disgust in the room was palpable. My family's faces hardened, their respect for me turning into open disdain for him. He looked around, searching for support, but found none. One by one, the people who had once smiled at him now turned away. He was alone. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a crack in the wall of arrogance, and I knew the confrontation had struck where it was meant to. He was exposed, stripped bare in front of the very people whose approval he had always taken for granted. The isolation had begun. The silence after my words stretched on like a wire pulled tight. My son shifted in his chair, his face red not from shame, but from the sting of being challenged. He picked up his phone, turning it over in his hands as if its glow could shield him from the eyes burning into him from all sides. That was when I leaned forward, folding my hands together on the table, and delivered the strike I had been preparing for weeks. "You think this is about medals?" I said evenly. "You think it is about trinkets you could sell for quick money. But what you do not realize is that those medals were only the beginning. Your betrayal forced me to see the truth. And because of that, everything I worked for, everything I saved, everything I built will never go to you." His head snapped up, his arrogance faltering. "What are you talking about?" I pulled a folder from the chair beside me and placed it on the table. The weight of it echoed as I let it fall. Inside were copies of every document I had signed with my lawyer and financial advisor. My relatives leaned closer as I slid the papers across the table. "These are the revisions to my estate," I said, my tone sharp and controlled. "Every account, every policy, every deed. Your name has been removed. You are no longer a beneficiary of anything I own." His face drained of color. He snatched one of the papers, scanning the legal text with wide eyes. "You can't do this," he stammered, his voice rising. "I'm your son. This house, your savings, your pension, it's supposed to be mine." "No," I said, my voice steady, cutting through his panic. "It was never yours. It was mine to give. And you made it clear you do not respect what I've given you. Why would I leave the work of my life in the hands of someone who sees sacrifice as junk? Why would I reward betrayal?" Around the table, my family's faces hardened in silent agreement. My sister nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on him. One of my cousins muttered, "Good. He doesn't deserve it." My son's arrogance cracked completely then. He shoved the papers back toward me, his voice desperate. "You can't just cut me out. I need this. You've always said you wanted me to have a future. How am I supposed to live without it?" "You should have thought of that before," I said coldly. "You had a future. I built it for you with my blood, my labor, and my sacrifices. But you sold it for a phone? You showed me exactly how little you valued what I've given you. So now you will live with nothing." The realization settled over him like a crushing weight. His phone, the object he had chosen over everything, sat useless in his trembling hands. For the first time, he understood that his arrogance had cost him not just the medals, not just my respect, but his future itself. The financial blow had landed, and there would be no recovery. At first he sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing as if the words would not come. Then the dam broke. His chair screeched back against the floor as he shot to his feet. The papers I had laid before him scattered across the table. His voice, once so smug and dripping with confidence, now cracked with panic. "You can't do this to me," he shouted, his face flushed. "I'm your son, your only son. Everything you worked for is supposed to come to me. That's how it works. You can't just erase me from your life because of some stupid medals." The room bristled at his words. My sister gasped. My cousin shook his head in disgust. I stayed seated, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my breathing even. His rage washed over me like waves against stone, loud but powerless. He leaned across the table, his fist slamming down inches from mine. "Do you know how this makes me look? My friends know I was supposed to inherit everything. They know you have money, the house, the land. Now what am I supposed to tell them? That my own father cut me out? You tell them the truth," I said calmly. "Tell them you sold your father's honor for a phone. Tell them you traded a legacy for something that will be worthless in a year." My words hit him harder than any raised fist could. His eyes burned with fury. And then, almost instantly, with desperation, he dropped back into his chair, his hands clutching his hair. "Please, Dad," he begged, his voice shaking now. "I didn't mean it like that. I was stupid. I'll make it right. I'll get the medals back somehow. Just don't do this. Don't cut me out. I need this." For a fleeting moment, I searched his face, hoping to see something genuine, some spark of true remorse. But even in his pleading, I heard it. The desperation was not for what he had lost in me, but for what he was losing in wealth and security. His panic was not about honor. It was about inheritance. You don't get it, do you? He continued, his voice breaking as he looked around the table. I've built my life on this. My friends look up to me because of what you have. They think I'll have it all one day. How do I face them if I have nothing? You'll make me a joke. The words sealed it. Even in the pit of his desperation, his mind was on appearances, on the shallow approval of others. He had not learned. He had not changed. I stood slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. My voice was quiet, but the steadiness in it left no room for doubt. This is not about your friends. This is about respect, about the line you crossed when you sold what could never be replaced. You took from me, you mocked me, and you spat on the sacrifices of men better than both of us. And now you face the cost. He sobbed once, angrily wiping at his face, then pointed a shaking finger at me. You'll regret this. You'll regret cutting me off. You'll be alone. I have been alone before, I said evenly, looking him directly in the eye. And I survived worse than this. But you will have to live with the choices you made, and you will finally learn that not everything in life can be bought or stolen. The silence that followed was deafening. His arrogance had crumbled, replaced by the hollow sound of desperation. My resolve remained untouched. The storm had broken, and I stood unshaken in its center. A week later, I drove to the memorial. The road was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes a man's thoughts louder than the hum of the engine. When I stepped out and walked across the gravel, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and stone warmed by the sun. The memorial rose ahead of me, solid and solemn, a wall etched with names I had carried in my heart for decades. I approached slowly, my steps deliberate, as if each one was a salute. My hand brushed across the carved letters, the grooves cold against my fingertips. I whispered some of the names under my breath, voices from the past that echoed still in the silence of my mind. These men had given everything. They had no chance to grow old, no chance to raise children, no chance to sit in a study decades later reflecting on life's choices. Their medals had been buried with them, their honor sealed in stone. I thought of my own medals then, gone from my possession but not from my story. My son had reduced them to cash, but standing there, in the presence of the fallen, I realized that their true value could never be sold. The medal was only a vessel. The meaning was here, in the lives remembered, in the legacy of sacrifice carved into the memorial. I sat on the bench nearby, watching the light shift across the wall. In that moment, I understood something that had eluded me before. My legacy was not in objects, not even in the medals I had once polished with pride. It was in the choices I made to honor sacrifice, to protect dignity, to ensure that what had been earned in blood was never treated as worthless. I had reclaimed that legacy by severing it from the hands of someone who would only tarnish it. The thought of my son drifted through my mind, but it no longer stung with the sharpness it once did. He had chosen his path. I had chosen mine. His future would be his to carry, stripped of the security he had once taken for granted. My future, however long remained, would be grounded in peace. Peace in knowing that I had stood firm, that I had defended not just my own honor, but the memory of the men who stood beside me in battle. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the memorial, I rose and gave one final glance at the names carved in stone. My hand touched the wall again, a silent vow that their sacrifices would not be forgotten, not by me and not by the choices I had made. I turned and walked back toward the car, the weight in my chest lighter than it had been in weeks. The medals might be gone, but honor remained. And honor, I knew now, could never be pawned. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt heavy with sorrow. My son had gone, taking his arrogance and desperation with him, leaving behind an echo of the life he thought he was entitled to. For the first time in years, I felt no need to chase after him, no urge to soften my stance or rescue him from the pit he had dug for himself. He would face his own consequences now, stripped of the safety net he once believed was guaranteed. That was his burden, not mine. I sat once more in my study, the folded flag resting on its shelf, the photographs of my unit watching from the walls. The empty case where my medals had once been no longer felt like a wound. It was a reminder of the lesson learned. Honor is not in the medal, nor in the ribbon, but in the choices we make to uphold what truly matters. My son had tried to erase that by reducing my life's sacrifices to cash, but instead he had only sharpened my resolve to protect their meaning. Peace settled over me in slow, steady waves. Not the shallow peace of forgetting, but the deep, hard-earned peace that comes from finally standing firm. I had spent years giving and forgiving, hoping my son would change, hoping my silence would teach him patience, but silence had only fed his entitlement. By speaking with action instead of words, I had drawn a line that could not be crossed. In doing so, I had reclaimed my dignity. I thought of him now, clutching his phone, wondering why the world no longer bent to his whims. He would come to understand, perhaps slowly, perhaps painfully, that greed has consequences. He would live without the inheritance he once boasted about, without the respect he had squandered. He would come to know that arrogance can collapse in an instant when faced with truth. That was his journey to walk. Mine was finished. As the evening sun poured through the window, I closed my eyes and let the warmth rest on my face. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, I breathed without the weight of anger pressing on my chest. My medals were gone, but their spirit remained with me. The values they represented had not been lost. I had defended them once on the battlefield, and now again in my own home. I rose from the chair and looked around the study, letting my gaze linger on the folded flag and the names in the photographs. I whispered a quiet promise to myself and to the men who had not come home that their sacrifices would never be in vain. And as I walked out of the room, I carried with me not bitterness, but peace. My son had chosen greed, I had chosen honor, and in that choice, I had won. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.